Hi, I'm Clara, and this is where it all began. In a house that smelled like lemon cleaner and old money, where every polite smile hid a ledger. I grew up thinking the worst thing that could happen to a family was silence. I was wrong. The worst thing was someone who smiled while they rewrote the rules. My father was a quiet man who loved numbers more than noise. He built a small empire from a single idea and a stubborn refusal to quit. When he married my stepmother, Evelyn, people said she was the perfect match, polished, poised, and impossibly efficient. She wore silk scarves like armor and had a laugh that sounded like a bell in a cathedral, beautiful, but echoing. At first, I wanted to like her. I wanted to believe she would be the person who kept our family steady. Instead, she became the person who kept the ledger. The $10 million wasn't a rumor. It was a line item in the will, a trust set up for the company's future and for my education. My father trusted Evelyn to manage it. He said, "She'll keep it safe." He said it with the kind of certainty that made me stop asking questions. I was 23, freshly graduated, and still learning how to be an adult in a house that had always felt like a museum. I had plans, a modest apartment, a small design studio, a life that didn't revolve around other people's expectations. The trust was supposed to be a safety net, not a sentence. The first sign that something was wrong was small and stupid enough that I almost missed it. Evelyn started calling me dear in a tone that made me feel like a child. She rearranged my father's study and put a framed photo of herself on his desk. She began to schedule meetings in the evenings and insisted I join family dinners where she would talk about budgets and legacy, as if we were discussing the weather. She praised my father in public and dismissed him in private. I watched him shrink into the chair by the window, hands folded, eyes tired. He stopped arguing. He stopped laughing. Then came the decisions. Evelyn moved the trust into a new management structure and told us it was for protection. She signed contracts, changed beneficiaries, and smiled while she explained fiduciary duty like a bedtime story. When I asked for a copy of the trust documents, she said, "You're young, Clara. Let the adults handle this." The word adult felt like a lock clicking shut. I felt the heat of humiliation rise in my chest, a hot, physical thing that made my palms sweat and my voice small. I remember the taste of metal in my mouth, the way my knees felt like they might give out. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed. The first real betrayal was public. At my father's birthday dinner, a small, awkward affair, Evelyn stood and toasted him. She praised his wisdom and foresight, and then, with a smile that was all teeth, announced a new scholarship funded by the trust. "For the next generation," she said, looking at me as if I were a prop. The room applauded. I clapped because everyone else did. Inside, something cold and hard settled. I felt invisible and ridiculous, like a character in someone else's story. After that, the slights multiplied. She began to micromanage my life under the guise of help. She criticized my apartment, my friends, my job prospects. She told me I was too impulsive to handle money. She called me sweet but naive in front of the board. Each insult was a pinprick. Each dismissal was a small theft of dignity. I started to keep a list in my head. The times she laughed at me, the times she rewrote the will, the times she made my father look small. The list became a map of wrongs. What made it worse was how everyone else reacted. My father's siblings nodded politely when Evelyn explained her decisions. Friends whispered that she was practical and savvy. The company's lawyers smiled and used words like restructuring and asset protection. No one saw the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, a look that said I was a problem to be managed. I felt alone in a crowded room. I tried to confront her once. I remember standing in the kitchen, the late light making the countertops glow, and saying, "Why won't you show me the documents? Why won't you let me see what's happening?" She turned slowly, the silk of her scarf whispering, and for a moment, she looked almost human. Then she smiled that bell laugh and said, "Clara, you're emotional. This is business. Trust me." The words landed like a slap. My hands trembled. I felt my face go hot, then cold. I wanted to tell her that trust is earned, not demanded. I wanted to tell her that she had no right to erase me. Instead, I walked away. That night, I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. I could hear the faint hum of the security system, the distant traffic, the clock in the hallway. My chest ached with a kind of grief I hadn't known I could feel for a living person. It wasn't just about money. It was about being sidelined, about watching someone take the thing my father had built and make it into a stage for her performance. It was about the way she had rewritten our family story without asking. I started to notice details I had ignored before. The way she kept 2 phones, the way she scheduled meetings at odd hours, the way she used phrases like liquidity event with a casual cruelty. I began to pay attention to the ledger of small humiliations. Each one was a stone in a wall she was building between me and my future. The anger that rose in me was not loud at first. It was a slow, steady burn that warmed my hands and sharpened my focus. I felt my body change, my jaw tightened, my breathing became deliberate, my thoughts narrowed into a single, dangerous clarity. I would not be erased. That clarity was the first step toward something I had never imagined I would do. I had always been the kind of person who avoided conflict, who smoothed edges and kept peace. But watching Evelyn take my father's legacy and turn it into her own stage made me realize that peace had a cost. The cost was my life. The cost was my dignity. And I was done paying. The months that followed felt like living inside a slow-motion collapse. Evelyn's control tightened. She began to make decisions that affected the company's employees, the scholarship recipients, and the family's future, always with a smile and a spreadsheet. She cut budgets for programs my father had championed and redirected funds to projects that bore her name. She hosted gala dinners where she posed with donors and signed checks with a flourish. Each public victory was a private wound. I tried to find allies. I spoke to my aunt in confidence, and she sighed and said, "People like her are good at appearances, dear. Don't make waves." I went to the company's HR director and asked about transparency. He offered platitudes and a brochure. I even tried to talk to my father, but he had retreated into a quiet resignation that felt like betrayal in itself. He would look at me with a softness that made my heart break and say, "She's keeping things together." His voice was small, and I could hear the fear in it. Fear of losing what he had built. Fear of the fight. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. I was at the office sorting through old files for a project when I found a folder that didn't belong to me. It was tucked behind a stack of annual reports, labeled in Evelyn's precise handwriting, "Trust Amendments." My hands went cold. I opened it and read. There were signatures, dates, and clauses that shifted control in ways that made my stomach drop. She had created shell accounts, moved funds into offshore entities, and set up a series of consulting payments to companies that, when I dug deeper, were linked to her friends. The paper smelled faintly of coffee and something else, the metallic tang of betrayal. I felt the room tilt. My pulse thudded in my ears. For a moment, I simply sat, the folder open on my lap, and let the facts settle. Then the old, familiar heat rose. Anger, yes, but also a cold, precise focus. This was no longer about being dismissed at dinner. This was theft. This was a deliberate plan to siphon the trust and rebrand it as her own fortune. The injustice was not abstract. It was written in ink. I didn't act like a person in a movie. I didn't storm into the boardroom with a dramatic speech. I did something quieter and, in its own way, more dangerous. I started to collect. I made copies of the documents, photographed receipts, and began to map the flow of money. I learned to read legalese like a second language. I stayed late at the office and watched the security footage, noting who came and went. I traced email headers and followed the breadcrumbs of wire transfers. Each discovery was a small victory and a new source of fear. If I was caught, the consequences could be severe. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. I also began to change how I presented myself. Where I had once been deferential, I became deliberately invisible in the ways that mattered. I learned to ask questions that sounded naive, but were designed to elicit details. I smiled when Evelyn entered a room and watched her hands. I learned the rhythm of her days. I found patterns, A weekly lunch with a particular lawyer, a monthly transfer on the 15th, a recurring invoice from a company with a name that meant nothing until I dug into its registration. The more I learned, the more the picture sharpened. There were nights when doubt crept in. I would lie awake and imagine the worst, being accused of theft, losing my father's trust, being ostracized by the family. I felt the old fear of being small. But then I would remember the way Evelyn had looked at me at that birthday dinner, the way she had toasted my father and erased me with a smile. I would remember the ledger and the shell companies and the scholarship that bore her name. The fear was still there, but it was now tempered by a fierce, moral clarity. This was not revenge for revenge's sake. This was justice. I found an ally in an unexpected place, Marcus, a junior accountant who had been with the company for years and had a quiet, stubborn integrity. He had noticed discrepancies too, but he was cautious. When I showed him the folder, his face went pale. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "We need proof. Solid proof. And we need a way to present it so they can't sweep it under the rug." His voice was steady, and for the first time since the discovery, I felt less alone. We made a plan that was careful and surgical. We would not confront Evelyn directly. We would not make accusations without evidence. Instead, we would build a case that would be impossible to ignore, a paper trail, corroborating testimony, and a public moment that would force the board and the family to act. We mapped timelines, cross-referenced invoices, and created a secure folder that only the two of us could access. We used burner emails and encrypted drives. The work was tedious and meticulous, but each line we connected felt like a stitch in a net. There were moments of moral wrestling. I asked myself if I was becoming what I hated, manipulative, secretive, willing to use deception to achieve an end. But then I would think of my father's quiet resignation and the scholarship that had been repurposed into a vanity project. I would think of the employees whose programs had been cut. The moral calculus shifted. This was not about humiliation. It was about restoring what had been stolen. As the plan took shape, I practiced restraint. I kept my face neutral in family gatherings. I laughed when Evelyn told a story and nodded when she praised herself. Inside, I rehearsed the moment when the net would close. I imagined her face when the ledger was exposed, the way her smile would falter. I imagined the sound of her bell laugh breaking. Those images were not cruel, they were a balm. They reminded me that justice could be precise and clean. The final piece of the plan required a public forum, the annual shareholders meeting. Evelyn loved those events. She thrived on applause and the soft glow of cameras. She would stand at the podium and talk about stewardship and legacy while the room hung on her every word. If we could present the evidence there, in front of the board and the family and the press, there would be nowhere for her to hide. But to do that, we needed one more thing, a witness who could speak to the pattern of payments and the shell companies. We needed someone with credibility. We found that person in an unlikely place, a retired auditor who had once worked with my father and who still cared about the company's mission. He agreed to review our files, and when he saw the pattern, his hands trembled. "This is deliberate," he said. "This isn't sloppy accounting. This is theft dressed as strategy." With his agreement, the plan felt real. The net was woven. The pieces were in place. I felt a strange calm settle over me, like the moment before a storm breaks. I was terrified, yes, but the fear had a purpose. It was no longer a paralyzing thing. It was a fuel. I slept poorly, but I slept with a sense of direction. The person I had been, the one who avoided conflict, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to fight with facts. On the morning of the shareholders' meeting, I dressed in a way that would not draw attention. I wanted to be invisible until the moment I needed to be seen. I carried the secure drive in my bag like a talisman. My hands were steady. My heart beat like a drum. I had rehearsed what I would say, how I would present the evidence, and how I would keep my voice calm. The plan was not about spectacle. It was about truth. And truth, I had learned, has a way of making even the most polished lies look cheap. The shareholders' meeting was held in the company's glass-walled auditorium, a place designed to make power look inevitable. Chandeliers hung like constellations, and the stage was a polished rectangle where people practiced authority. Evelyn arrived in a tailored suit and a smile that had been honed for cameras. She moved through the room like a queen, shaking hands, accepting praise. My stomach tightened as I watched her take the podium, the microphone catching the practiced cadence of her voice. She began with the usual platitudes: stewardship, vision, legacy. The room nodded. Cameras rolled. I sat near the back, a small, unremarkable figure with a bag that contained the thing that would change everything: the secure drive, the auditor's signed statement, and a printed timeline that traced the money from the trust to the shell companies and then to Evelyn's circle. I felt the weight of it like a physical thing. When the Q&A opened, I raised my hand. My voice felt small at first, but it steadied as I spoke. "I have a question about the trust's recent amendments," I said. "Who authorized the transfers to these entities?" I watched Evelyn's face for the first flicker of unease. She smiled and deflected, as she always did. "All actions were taken in the company's best interest," she said. "We have legal counsel and oversight." That was the moment Marcus had prepared for. He stood and asked for clarification about a specific invoice. The retired auditor, who had been sitting quietly, then rose and said, "I've reviewed these documents. These transfers are inconsistent with fiduciary duty." His voice was calm, but the room shifted. People leaned forward. The board members exchanged looks. Evelyn's smile faltered. I walked to the podium with the printed timeline in my hand. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I placed the documents on the lectern and began to speak, not with the theatrical fury I had imagined, but with a steady, precise voice. I narrated the trail of money, the shell companies, the consulting fees that led to accounts linked to Evelyn's associates. I read clauses aloud. I showed the signatures. I watched faces change from polite interest to shock. Evelyn's reaction was immediate and raw. Her eyes narrowed. Her mouth tightened. For the first time, the bell laugh was gone. She tried to interrupt, to call it a misunderstanding, to accuse us of misreading legal language. But the auditor had already spoken. Marcus had corroborated the accounting. The documents were there, printed and undeniable. The room hummed with the sound of a machine that had been set in motion. The board chair called for a recess, but the damage was done. Reporters who had been present began to murmur. Phones were out. Evelyn's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in real time. She moved through the room like someone trying to find an exit. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a scene from outside my body. The humiliation I had imagined for her was not a gloating thing. It was a release. The tightness in my chest loosened. In the days that followed, the company launched an internal investigation. Lawyers were involved. Evelyn's accounts were frozen. The shell companies were traced and exposed. The press picked up the story, and the narrative shifted from restructuring to alleged embezzlement. Evelyn's public persona cracked. She gave interviews that sounded rehearsed and brittle. She tried to claim that she had acted in good faith, that the transfers were part of a long-term strategy. People who had once praised her began to ask questions. The most satisfying moment came not from a courtroom or a headline, but from a small, private scene. My father, who had been a ghost in his own life, came to me one evening with a folder. His hands trembled as he handed it over. Inside were letters he had written but never sent, notes about the trust, and a simple line in his handwriting. I was wrong to trust her alone. He looked at me with a vulnerability that made my throat ache. "I'm sorry," he said. The apology was not dramatic. It was a quiet, human thing that felt like balm. Evelyn's fall was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. The board removed her from her position pending the investigation. Her friends distanced themselves. The gala invitation stopped. She tried to fight back with lawyers and denials, but the evidence was a net that held. The scholarship she had renamed was restored to its original purpose. The programs she had cut were reinstated. The money began to be accounted for, and the company started the slow, painful work of repair. People asked me if I felt triumphant. The truth was more complicated. There was relief, yes, a deep, physical exhale that felt like air returning to lungs that had been compressed. There was also sorrow. I had wanted my father's legacy preserved, not to watch a person I had once tried to, be destroyed. I had wanted justice, not vengeance. But the two had become entangled. Watching Evelyn's public unraveling, I felt a strange empathy for the human cost of exposure. She had chosen to weaponize trust, and she had to face the consequences. That was the moral center of what we had done. In the weeks after, I found myself walking through the office and noticing small things. Employees smiling again, programs humming back to life, the scholarship recipients receiving letters that were not stamped with Evelyn's name. The company felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. My father began to come out of his shell. He laughed in a way that made me cry. He started to attend meetings again, not as a man hiding from the world, but as someone who had been given a second chance. There were legal proceedings, of course. Evelyn faced charges and a civil suit. She hired expensive lawyers and fought hard. The courtroom scenes were messy and public, and they did not provide the neat closure that movies promise. But the core truth remained. The trust was being restored, and the people who had been hurt were being heard. The emotional payoff for me was not a headline or a courtroom victory. It was a small, private moment in my father's study. He took my hand and said, "You did the right thing." His voice was steady. I felt the years of humiliation and fear dissolve into something like peace. I cried then, not from triumph, but from the release of a pressure I had carried for too long. I also learned something about myself. I discovered that I could be brave in ways I had never imagined. I learned that justice sometimes requires risk, and that silence can be a form of complicity. I learned to trust my instincts and to gather facts before acting. Most of all, I learned that revenge, when shaped by truth and restraint, can be a form of repair. The story didn't end with a single dramatic moment. It ended with a series of small restorations, programs reopened, scholarships awarded, and a family that began to speak again. Evelyn's life after the fall was quieter, and she was forced to reckon with the consequences of choices she had made. I don't take pleasure in her pain, but I do take satisfaction in the restoration of what was stolen. In the end, justice wasn't about spectacle. It was about restoring what was taken and refusing to be erased. If someone you love is being sidelined, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is gather the facts and speak the truth.